As we talk about creation, why does geology matter? I mean, who cares about geology? Rocks. Well, if you get the rocks wrong, you're going to get everything else wrong. You're going to get the time frame of the Earth wrong. You're going to get the understanding of why these rock layers contain fossils wrong. You're actually going to end up totally misunderstanding the very character of God Himself, the very nature of God, when you misunderstand the history of the rocks and what they tell us about this planet. For instance, let me tell you a story, an actual account of one young man who got the rocks wrong and what it led to. Now, you have to go back to the 1700s to understand the background and the thinking of what was happening in this young man's mind. Now, in the 1700s, the church leaders were, in essence, the leaders and the intellectuals of the day. They were the ones with a higher education. They were the ones that taught the next generation about truth and reality, in essence, where things came from. The young man I'm talking about was born in the early 1800s, and as a very intelligent man from a fairly well-to-do family, he was sent to college and he was studying theology, and he was going to be a pastor, in essence. Now, he decided that's not what he wanted to do with his life. What he really wanted to do was be a naturalist. Now, the word naturalist was the word used 200 years ago to mean scientist. They studied the natural world around them to understand things about it. The scientific revolution was going on. We're really starting to understand where things came from, how the natural world operated. And folks would collect various plants and animals and go on travels and come back and lecture in the concert halls of the day. This is what this young man wanted to do. So he signed up for a 5-year journey and he sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. One of the first places he came to was Argentina. Now, this young man took with him essentially 2 books. One was the Bible. Remember, he was a theology student. The other was a book called Principles of Geology by a man named Charles Lyell. Now, Charles Lyell to this day is called the father of modern geology. He, along with others of his generation, had been trained that there was never a worldwide flood, because a worldwide flood would have created the rock layers of this planet very rapidly. All of the sediments would have settled to form sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock, limestone, sandstone, mudstone, coal, shale, it covers about 75% of the Earth's surface. Well, if there wasn't a worldwide flood that created these rock layers, where did they come from? He would look at enormously thick layers of rock and say it must have taken enormous periods of time to have slowly, gradually made these rock layers. In other words, he proposed a theory called uniformitarianism. Slow, gradual processes we see today can be extended enormous periods into the past to explain enormous geological changes that created the rock layers and the river valleys and the seams of sediment that we see. Well, he collected thousands of observations that supported this idea, put them in the book called Principles of Geology, and our young explorer took this book with him, and he was highly influenced by this thinking. In other words, his brain was trained to think in that way and filter everything he saw through that viewpoint. Well, he arrives in Argentina. He sees the Santa Cruz River Valley, a little teeny river at the bottom of an enormous valley. He thinks to himself, it must have taken millions of years, enormous periods of time, for that little river to have carved out this huge valley, a little grain of sand at a time over eons and eons of time. And he could find seashells way up high in the sediment layers, meaning over huge periods of time, the surface slowly rose out of the ocean as the ocean deposited these sediment layers. Now, he took this same mindset. Little changes over enormous periods of time, creating the geology of our planet, which is just an interpretation, not a fact. It's just a philosophical viewpoint. And he sailed on around South America and ended up at the Galapagos Islands. Now, I think already many of you know who I'm talking about, Charles Darwin. And on this island he saw finches with many different sized beaks. And he thought to himself, Maybe you have those different shaped beaks and different shaped birds because as one generation had another and another and another and another, over eons and eons of time, maybe one kind of an animal could have turned into a completely different kind of animal. So he totally misinterpreted the data that led him to believe into geological evolution, and that led him to believe in biological evolution. Little changes, lots of time changing one animal into another. You see, if these rock layers are filled with millions and trillions of dead animals that have formed over millions and billions of years, that means there's been death and disease and bloodshed and extinctions for millions of years. Well, that's long before mankind appeared, according to modern textbooks. So who's responsible for death and disease and bloodshed and extinctions? It can't be mankind or his actions because he wasn't around. God himself must be the author of death if those rock layers are that old. You see, the misunderstanding of the rock layers affects our very perception of the very character of God. All evolution is a story to try to explain everything as if God doesn't even exist. And it gets geology wrong, it gets biology wrong, it gets the age of the universe wrong because it starts by leaving God's word out. We are standing on the shore of Lake Superior, which is the largest freshwater lake in the entire world, to talk about geology. And the question folks who are trying to understand this earth have is, how did enormous features like this form? Now in this case, whether you believe in evolution or whether you believe in creation, really everybody has come to exactly the same conclusion. This lake exists, this enormous body of water exists because there was an ice age upon this planet. Now if you look at Lake Superior, it is so large you could for days sail across this lake and not see any land. Now this is the biblical explanation for why this enormous body of water exists. You see, following the worldwide flood, the oceans of the world would have been much, much warmer than today. During the flood, the fountains of the great deep broke forth. There was enormous volcanism, enormous land movements. The mountain chains of the world were not built up until the end of the flood. All of these things heated up the oceans of the world, causing much more evaporation than we see today. Now it's evaporation from the oceans that drives the weather patterns of the world. That evaporated water had to go somewhere. It came down as snowfall in Canada, in Siberia, in Russia, all the northern and southern latitudes of the world. The forecast every day would have been snow. Snow today, snow tomorrow, snow next week, snow next month, snow next year, decade after decade, century after century. Now, once again, take a look at Lake Superior. It is enormous in its scope and depth and size. Imagine this entire body of water, not as water, but as solid ice, 1,000 feet deep ice. And above that 1,000 feet of ice, it continued to build up and build up and build up to the point scientists believe the glaciers that covered this area were 1 to 2 miles deep. Now keep in mind, it takes about 10 inches of snowfall to make 1 inch of ice as it's compacted and compacted and compacted. So we're not talking feet of snow, we're talking 20 miles of snow in order to compact down and make 2 miles of ice. Enormous amounts of water. Now, as the weight built up and those huge glaciers shoved forward, that's what dug out the Great Lakes. And that's how the Ice Age fits into biblical history. It probably continued to build up for hundreds of years after the flood ended, about 4,500 years ago. And after 400, 500, 600 years, the oceans cooled down, the evaporation slowed, and then the cloud cover across the earth would have lessened, allowing more heat from the sun, less evaporation, and the glaciers started to melt back, leaving these enormous Great Lakes we find in the central northern United States. But the main thing we're going to talk about in this sequence are the rock layers. It is the rock layers of the Earth that formed during this worldwide flood. But what evidence is there that these layers, layer after layer after layer, were laid down rapidly over this 1 year period and not over millions and billions of years? Now here at the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, there are interpretive signs that say the sandstone in this area started to form during the Cambrian period of the Earth. Now that's just a fancy name given to a certain layer of rock. Doesn't mean it was that old. No one was there to see it form, but they give it a scientific name to distinguish it from other rock layers. And these signs will say that started about 500 million years ago. And this layer of rock is kind of red colored because it's filled with iron. And then you'll see other layers on top of that that are given other time frames. Up until 10 to 20 million years ago, the top layers of sandstone formed. Now the interesting thing is that there is enormous supposed missing time between the sandstone layers. As you look at these layers of rock in the background, you see perfectly horizontal layers that have been laid down between the different supposed time eras where different sandstones were formed. You'll notice there's just a perfectly straight seam between the layers. These are called strata, the strata of the rock. Now you see these same things as you drive down an interstate highway. You'll see perfectly horizontal layers of rock. As you look out west at erosional features, you see perfectly horizontal layers of rock. It is the norm in rock layers around the Earth. Now, here's what makes that so significant. How do you form a perfectly horizontal flat layer? I mean, we're not talking for a few feet or a few miles. We're talking at times for hundreds of miles, a totally flat, totally straight seam line. Sometimes it runs across an entire continent. The Coconina sandstone is given various names, but it runs all the way from the southern United States up into Montana and all the way across the United States, showing up in other areas. Perfectly flat layer of rock. And at times, some layers, like the Chattanooga Shale in Tennessee, running across the entire continent, it is only about 20 feet thick. Never more, sometimes less, but at most 20 feet thick, perfectly horizontal layer. How do you lay something like that down if you didn't have a flood event upon this Earth? Well, evolutionary geologists need enormous amounts of time to allow the belief in evolution to be true, if it is true. Now it's not, but they need the time to pretend it's true. So they put huge periods of time for the laying down of these rock layers. Or they say maybe they were laid down rapidly over a huge region, but then there was an enormous amount of time between the rock layers. Well, if that were true, you would have to have a landscape totally flat over 1,000-mile space, like the flatness of a pool table covering 1,000 miles. There is no place anywhere on Earth where that exists. You can't go anywhere and find a landscape that flat. And furthermore, if that flat layer laid there over time, erosion and wind and water, they would dig ruts and gullies into that landscape, meaning it would not remain flat. And yet as we look at the rock layers, we see these perfectly flat surfaces between very different types of sediment. See, that is the number one evidence that these layers weren't laid down over huge periods of time. You don't see erosion between the layers, and they're so flat and level from one layer into the next. They were laid down as sheets of sediment were washed around and sorted and laid down in perfectly horizontal beds over huge regions, because this flood that caused them was worldwide in extent. Now, a second evidence of how we can know these rock layers were laid down rapidly is because we don't see soil in between them. As you go from one kind of rock, from say, shale to coal to limestone to mudstone back to shale or limestone, you'll see layer laid on top of layer laid on top of layer, but you don't see soil in between. And yet anywhere today where you see stuff laying down, even if sand is laid on a beach, you get a little bit farther back away from the beach, you see trees and vegetation growing and forming soil, and yet that's not what we find in these rock layers. A third evidence for the rapid deposition of rock layers around the Earth is the fact that many of them are folded and bent. Now, to illustrate exactly what's going on, let's talk about these tilted rock layers that we find right over here. Now, you see these rock layers, they're not perfectly horizontal the way we looked at the other rock layers. They're actually tilted at an angle. You see, what was happening during the flood, sediment was continuously being laid down in certain areas, moved to other areas. You realize this event was an entire year-long event. It wasn't just 40 days and 40 nights of rain. Now, early on, there was likely sorted out sediment that was laid down as layers of sand that turned into sandstone. But as the very continental plates were moving around later in the flood, many of these layers were shoved and tilted upwards. Now, you'll notice these ones are tilted at an angle. As you look at the park signs here, it says these are Cambrian rocks that are 500 million years old. They were tilted and then sheared off, and other layers of sand were laid on top of them. And then millions and millions of years would pass, and another layer of sand would be laid on top of that. That's your classic textbook explanation to explain the different rock layers. But does it make sense? You see, around the world, we find mountain chains where sediment has been shoved upward, laid down horizontal. Like one layer might be a layer of sand mixed with pebbles, like this sheet of tile was laid down, and then over millions of years it would harden, and then another layer would come and be laid down on top of it, and millions of years later another layer, and so on. Except that explanation leaves out what the Bible tells us is the reality of this planet. During the year-long flood, layer after layer would be laid down, one after another, after another, after another. And then as the continents were moving around later in the flood, these layers were shoved and buckled upwards, making these slants. But in many mountain chains around the world, you find folded and bent layers. They're just like curved and bent without being broken. Now, if millions of years pass, think about this. It would be like a layer of rock being laid down. It sits there for millions of years until another layer of rock comes and slides over on top of it. And it sits there for millions of years. And then another different kind of rock or shale or lime would harden and form another layer. And the mountains are believed to have been pushed up very late in the Earth's history. So those rock layers that formed the mountains had to be laying there for tens or hundreds of millions of years if evolution is true. I could take this tile and I could soak it underwater, say for 1,000 years, 100,000 years, it's still going to be hard. It's still not going to flex and bend. Matter of fact, when I try to bend it, it doesn't bend. If I add more force, let's say I do that, you see what happens? It doesn't just bend, it shatters and breaks. And yet the rock layers of our planet in the mountains, they're not broken, they're smoothly bent. Now here's what the evolutionists do with this information. They know the rock layers are bent without being broken. They say, well, maybe, and it's always the maybe, possibly, perhaps theory, not matching reality, but if they throw out an idea that seems on its surface could explain things. They say, well, maybe deep in the earth under lots of pressure when rock is bent, it doesn't break. It just bends without breaking. Well, if that's true, if you took a layer of sediment and you bent it on the inside surface, it would be compressed, and on the outside surface, it would be extended. So in that same layer that's been bent, you should see a different characteristic on the inside versus the outside of the bend. That's not what we see. You see, if it was bent while it was still soft and a mud-like consistency, then it would flow and you'd get a pretty uniform characteristics of the rock throughout the bend area. That is what we see. You see the sediment that formed the mountains of the earth was laid down rapidly, layer after layer after layer, in a very brief period of time, and then the mountains were shoved up near the end of the flood, and that explains why they look the way they look. This whole idea of enormous periods of time forming those layers absolutely contradicts the evidence of why they look the way they do. One of the other evidences that a worldwide flood is the correct explanation for the sedimentary rock layers of the earth is the existence of these packed together fossil graveyards that we find all over the world. They're not like rare, they're actually quite common. Now, for instance, is you look at this rock, it's a layer of basically shale or mudstone, which is in essence mud that's been compacted down and turned into rock. Now, as you look closer, you find trails or tracks of things that were crawling along, impressions of worm-like creatures, ancient extinct animals called crinoids, seashells that look identical to seashells today. As a matter of fact, about 95% of all fossils are sea creatures because the flood just wiped out trillions of animals that lived in the ocean, and they got buried into this mud that built up as fossil record. Now, if you look closer, you'll see just dozens and dozens of little animals and seashells and things that are compacted into these rock layers. You find them on both the front and the back. Now, that is not a living environment. These animals didn't live that closely together. They were picked up by this flood, moved in enormous waves, compacted and forced down to turn into fossils that we find today in these rock layers all over the earth. Now, the other thing we often find are sea creatures buried in these fossil graveyards along with land creatures. Dinosaurs found with seashells, possums found with fish. These things don't live together. They were destroyed by this enormous flood, washed together, compacted, and turned into layers and layers of rocks, such as this, all over the world. Strong evidence that this worldwide flood is reality. One of the strongest evidences for a world-covering flood that created all the sediment and sedimentary rock layers of the earth are what are called polystrate fossils. We'll often see trees like this laying in a forest in a horizontal position, but imagine a tree not laying horizontally but vertically, running up through multiple strata layers or many different levels of different kinds of sediment. Suppose you walk through a forest one day and you find a tree laying on the ground like this. Do you think it's still going to be here, say, 100 years from now? Or how about 1,000 years from now? You know it's not. It's going to turn back into soil. You see there are locations in Germany and Nova Scotia. There's a very classic one in Cookeville, Tennessee, where a fossilized tree going through a coal seam that's about 20 feet thick, up through a limestone layer that's another 10 to 20 feet thick, and then into a second coal seam. Now, if what we hear about the layers of the earth being millions and billions of years old is correct, in essence, what that is saying is that there was a tree standing upright while the coal formed, and then an ocean moves in, and slowly limestone starts to form around the tree as diatoms and plankton and various sea creatures die. And then the ocean recedes, another swamp forms, and another coal layer forms, all while the tree is standing upright. Now, think about that. You have a tree standing upright for hundreds of thousands or millions of years without ever toppling over, while an ocean comes and goes and swamps come and go. It makes absolutely no sense. What makes perfect sense, what is an absolutely obvious explanation, is that one layer after another were rapidly laid down, and that's why there can be polystrate fossils. So once again, here's another example of how we can know these rock layers were laid down sequentially and rapidly with no missing time in between, exactly as the Bible tells us. There are sheer vertical cliffs made of sandstone and limestone, relatively soft sedimentary rock, all over the western United States, in Utah and Montana, in Wyoming, in Colorado. You see these big, tall, vertical cliffs, as you see behind me, made of various sedimentary layers. These vertical cliffs form a very important clue as to the age of these sedimentary layers. You see, over time, wind and freezing and thawing and cracking and rain just beats away at these cliffs, causing rocks the size of large boulders to little pebbles of grains of sand and limestone to slough off and kind of collect as a rubble at the bottom of the cliff. The rubble you see at the bottom of these cliffs, its technical name is talus, and it builds up at the bottom of any vertical rock face. Now here's the issue. This rock layer, this rubble at the bottom, is building up in noticeably rapid time. Now some of these boulders weigh thousands and thousands of pounds, and these valley floors below these cliffs are just flat. There is no mechanism to remove this rubble. Now we're told these cliffs are anywhere from 10 to hundreds of millions of years old, and they're some of the youngest geological features on this planet, and the valleys have been there for that same period of time. So the question is, why is there not an enormous layer of rubble at the bottom? If there really have been millions of years, the very cliff would be gone. You'd see nothing but a rounded pile of rubble. You see, the fact that there aren't huge layers of talus or rubble at the bottom of these cliffs is very strong testimony that those cliffs aren't millions of years old. We're at the Petrified National Forest to look at yet another example of how we can know, based on the fossils and the rocks and the artifacts we find, that the layers on the Earth really accumulated rapidly without lots of missing time between the layers. Now, if you look at what I'm sitting on, it's obviously a tree, or it used to be a tree, and it's broken into segments. And as always, the question arises, because nobody has a time machine, how did this tree turn into solid rock, and when did this happen? Well, again, we always need to apply God's Word and then draw logical inferences from what it says is the history of this planet. You see, during Noah's flood, every tree would have been ripped up. Every living substance was destroyed. Not just the animals, but the plants, every blade of grass. Pulverized, moved around. But the trees wouldn't necessarily have been pulverized like dirt and rocks that doesn't move as other things abrade across them. They would have been floating in huge floating vegetation mats. Well, in certain areas, under very unique circumstances, these trees would have settled and been covered with other sediment and then buried deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, remember what the naturalistic evolutionary viewpoint is. These rock layers formed over millions of years. Well, think about a tree laying or falling in a forest and laying there for not millions of years, but even dozens of years or hundreds of years. They would just deteriorate and turn into dust. And yet these trees are clearly fully formed trunks of large trees. As you look around at the scenery throughout this park, you find areas where there are tens of thousands of pieces of trunks of trees just laying there. It's like they've been washed together, buried with sediment, and then turned to rock. Now, it does not take millions of years for petrification to happen. It can happen in a matter of months or years. See, these trees happen to be log jammed and buried in an area where there was lots and lots of very high mineral content water, lots of silica and magnesium and manganese and potassium, and it oozed into the pores of the very wood, solidified, the carbon deteriorated and disappeared, leaving the exact structure of the wood. Now, how do we know whether it happened rapidly or slowly? And how do we know there isn't time between layers? You have all these trees being buried by sediment. Okay, now look at this particular piece of wood. It's actually broken and opened up. You can see all the gorgeous colors of different minerals, but you'll notice they're not circular in structure. they've been squeezed into an oval shape. Now, if it had taken enormous periods of time for this to happen, as slowly and gradually the sediment built up around the tree and it slowly petrified, it would have maintained its circular ring shape as it turned to rock. But had these trees been buried rapidly underneath a layer of mineral-filled sediment, and then another layer of sediment built up on top of it with millions of pounds of weight shoving down on it, before the tree could have turned to rock, it could have been squished into an oval shape as the petrification continued. So the fact that a large percentage of trees found in the park are oval in shape means that they were compressed and crushed by the overlying sediment while they were turning to stone, not after they turned to stone, which means layer after layer after layer build up very rapidly. It destroys the whole idea of millions of years between the layers of rock. You'll notice this tree's broken into segments. It almost looks like someone came along with a chainsaw and started cutting through this solid rock. You just get segment after segment after segment, and they've tumbled down the hill here. Well, why is that? Well, you understand there was a big vegetation mat. It gets buried. It's at a certain level for the most part. But then, as the dirt erodes away underneath of these columns, well, what's going to happen when you have a 10,000-pound column of stone and one end of it starts to sag? It's going to snap. And then as it continues to sag, it'll snap again and snap again and snap again, and you get these segments happening. This happened subsequent to the flood, the individual segments of petrified wood. The petrification happened during the flood, and the very nature of the look of the petrified wood testifies to a rapid development of the rock layers in which that was trapped. There's a key verse in the book of Psalms which states that one generation shall praise thy works to another and shall declare thy mighty acts. Now, one of the mighty acts of God is the worldwide flood that totally deluged and destroyed this planet. Now, every act of God is ultimately an act of love. Why would a flood that must have killed millions of people, how could that be an act of love? Well, God understands the nature of mankind. He understands the rebellion of mankind, and He understands that generation after generation after generation, mankind is going to forget that the wages of sin is death. But God realizes if we forget that, far more people are going to die and be destroyed and be removed for all eternity from His holiness and His purity because of their sinfulness. They're simply going to forget that the consequences of their sin is death. God didn't want to bring judgment generation after generation after generation after generation through all of human history to keep reminding us of this. So what did God do? When mankind was at the point where had God waited any longer, there would not have been a single person who was willing to continue to follow and obey God. He brought a judgment upon this planet that ripped up and wiped out every animal, every plant, packed it down and formed the very rock layers we walk on. So all mankind has to do, any place on this planet, throughout all of history, is to look down at the rock layers he's walking on and see that it is death, filled with death. There because of our sinful rebellion. That's why those rock layers exist. Now, remember what that verse said. It said, one generation shall praise the works of God to the next generation. They shall declare His mighty acts. There was a moment in history where Jesus made sure the mighty act of God, the worldwide flood, would not be forgotten. And it's in the New Testament. In Luke chapter 19, Jesus for the first time is coming into Jerusalem, and He is declaring Himself as God, as the Messiah. And the people are worshiping Him. They are acknowledging that. And the Pharisees tell Jesus, You need to stop your disciples. They are in essence declaring that you are God. It says, the whole multitude of disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works they had seen. Does that sound familiar? They're praising God's mighty works. In Psalms, we're told to tell the next generation of God's mighty works. And what was Jesus' response when he was told to silence his disciples? I tell you that if they should hold their peace, the very stones would immediately cry out. Do you understand that locked into the very stones is the reality that our sin brings death? You see, the very stones are crying out. The fact there are perfectly flat layers of sediment shows they were laid down over huge regions by a worldwide flood, a judgment of our sin. The fact there's no soil between the layers show that there wasn't time between each layer. The fact there are polystrate fossils show that one after another was laid down rapidly with no time between the seams. The fact there are enormous beds of fossils that have been washed together, sea creatures and land creatures, testify to the worldwide nature of this flood that happened. The mighty acts of God are true at a time when many denominations and many churches have denied God's word and have quit teaching what it says about a world-covering flood. The rocks themselves are crying out to the reality and the truth of this event. The wages of sin are death. And the only way to come back into fellowship with God is to accept what He has done to take that penalty of death upon Himself so that we can come back into fellowship with Him. And we will not spend an eternity totally separated from a loving God who made us. We started this section talking about Charles Darwin's voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, ending up in Argentina, and looking at the Santa Cruz River Valley, and how Darwin had misinterpreted how that valley formed because he didn't factor rapid change into his thinking. He had been trained to think in terms of slow, gradual processes we see happening today, explaining the enormous geological features of the planet. Now, had Charles Darwin had access to Google Maps and look upstream at the origins of the Santa Cruz River Valley, he would have seen the remains even today of an enormous glacier that would have carved out this river valley very, very rapidly. As a matter of fact, no geologist today believes that the Santa Cruz River Valley was carved out by slow, gradual processes over millions of years. And yet that thinking still permeates their thought processes as they interpret the world around us. Once again, just to summarize and emphasize, evolutionists, evolutionary thinking will always choose slow, gradual, enormous time periods, either in the formation of the rock layers or the time between very distinct types of rock layers, because without that enormous periods of time, they have no option other than a clear biblical viewpoint for how to explain why the fossils and why the rocks exist. And at the very start of their thinking, they eliminate that from consideration. Now, let me give you one other example of how evolutionists use this idea of enormous time periods to create the rock layers of the earth as the foundation for their thinking. And that's the cliffs of Dover. Now, we've all seen these gorgeous scenes of these chalky white, brilliant cliffs made from calcium carbonate on the shoreline of England along the English Channel. Now, as a matter of fact, chalk is a specific kind of ultra-pure calcium carbonate chemicals that have built up to form these layers of rock that we find all over the world. It's been estimated that somewhere in the few percent to 10% of a lot of the Earth's surface is covered by these chalk beds. A lot of Austin, Texas and Dallas, Texas is covered with a huge, thick, hundreds of feet layer of chalk. These cliffs of Dover extend across England, across the English Channel into France, up north into the Scandinavian countries, and up here other places on across Europe as these ultra pure chalk beds. Now, what is chalk? Chalk, and we've all seen this, little children drawing on sidewalks with chalk. It's a very pure white substance, but if you could magnify it and look at it very, very close with microscopes, you will actually see microorganisms, plankton, a certain type of plankton. Their lifespan is only a matter of days. They will form their shells from calcium carbonate, which then will drift down and form a layer of sediment on the bottom of oceans. Now, the oceans today, they have what is called just an ooze at the bottom. There's dead creatures, precipitated minerals that collect and form a very thick layer of soft unconsolidated sediment at the bottom of the oceans. Out in the middle of the Pacific Atlantic Ocean, it can be hundreds of feet thick. Near the shoreline and continental shelves, it can be 1,000 or more feet thick. And in the range of 30% of this ocean ooze at the bottom of these oceans are made up of this calcium carbonate from planktons that can then be compacted and turned into a chalk layer. But here's the curious fact. Those enormous cliffs of Dover, they are 1,300 feet thick. They are ultra pure, 98% or more pure shells of these plankton type creatures. Now, if we look at the rate of accumulation of these plankton today, it would take in the order of about 1,000 years to compact and form 1/2 inch of this chalk-like structure. So 1,000 years to form 1/2 inch, you have 1,300 feet of this layer. If you do the math, it turns out you would expect it to take about 30 million years to form this 1,300 feet thick layer, which is about the time frame evolutionists give to this layer of chalk. So in their mind, they have justified and confirmed, if not proven, their belief of multiple millions of years to form this layer. Now, this is even very, very convincing to folks who believe in creation. They give up on the biblical time frame and accept millions of years to form rock layers based on this kind of evidence. And yet they leave catastrophic changes out of their mindset. Now, even today, there are what are called blooms of plankton and microorganisms. Things like white tides and red tides, where there are billions of microorganisms and plankton that multiply and multiply and multiply hundreds and thousands of times faster than we see today to completely fill ocean surfaces with their shells that then die off because of their overpopulation and their using up of the available nutrients. We have measured, even today, in these enormous blooms of microorganisms inside of the ocean's layers, as many as 10 billion of these little plankton microorganisms per quart of water, which would then die and settle to the bottom. Now this is thousands of times more highly concentrated than your typical concentration of these organisms settling to the bottom today. In order to support that type of a population over an enormous area, you would have to have three things happening. You would have to have massive wave movement, which would stir the water and allow for oxygenation. You would have to have enormous amounts of decaying matter and nitrogen available to allow this growth of these plants. And you would have to have enormous amounts of CO2 dissolved in the water. Think of the conditions during the flood in certain areas. Enormous volcanism would have spewed forth huge quantities of CO2 to have been dissolved in the water, way above levels we see today. Everything on this planet was wiped out, buried, and decaying in certain areas of the ocean would have formed enormous amounts of nitrogen-rich pollution, in essence, in the water, and there would have been lots of wave action to have mixed these things up. ideal conditions for massive regional blooms of microorganisms. A totally logical, biblical understanding of how things like the cliffs of Dover could have formed would have been blooms of microorganisms, not over some small little bay, but covering hundreds of square or thousands of square miles of this flooded ocean filled with decaying matter that then dropped down and formed layer after layer of this chalk very, very rapidly, that was then compacted and formed things like the chalk beds of Dover. Now, there's no reason to assume this couldn't have happened. We see data showing things like this happening today. We just don't see it on large regional type areas. But its supporting evidence is the purity of these beds. There is no possibility that over millions, tens of millions of years, you could slowly settle dead plankton sea creatures and not have it filled with bones and sand and mud and other sediment and all sorts of impurities the way we find ocean beds today. So once again, you have two viewpoints: slow, gradual settling, huge periods of time, or catastrophic conditions as described by the Bible. Christians need to take God's word seriously. He means what he tells us. And when we apply that to our thinking and look at the mechanisms that are happening in the world today, we can explain even things like enormously thick sediment layers over very rapid periods of time without even stretching our imagination. We just have to understand the conditions going on during the flood were different than the conditions happening today, and they explain the world of the past better than enormous periods of time and slow, gradual processes of today.